What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Hollywood Already Did It, your weekly movie podcast for things that have been rebooted, remade, sequelized, adapted, or otherwise unoriginal and have source material, and whether or not we need to keep going back to these wells. As always, I am your host, Blake Schultz, and with me is Terrence Tatum.
Hello, everyone.
And this week we are going into the 2021 release of Dune, another movie that was delayed on delayed on delayed, a remake or adaptation, however you want to look at it, of a disaster of a 1984 movie based off of one of the most important, classic, and influential sci-fi novels, arguably of all time. And here we are. We finally did it. Terrence, what did you think of Dune? Where did you see Dune? How did you experience Dune?
There was no way that I was not seeing this in the theater, so I definitely did not do the HBO Max, although I will subsequently watch it multiple times afterwards via that way. But yes, I watched this. I went to Universal City Walk here in LA, which is a theater that I don't frequent to go to. Usually my trips over there are event films like Dark Knight. I've been seeing that in the IMAX there, just because of the parking and just it's a kind of a pain to get to. But I was like, all right, this is where we're going. And I went there and my mind was blown. I don't know what I was thinking that I was getting into. I have not read the book, although I'm a huge sci-fi nerd. This is a movie in a series in the franchise that sort of has escaped me. And I call myself trying to watch the David Lynch version the night before. And Jesus, that is an experience. We'll talk about that in a bit, but for this one, walked in and walked out just smiling from ear to ear. I think you said the same thing off mic, but I immediately purchased the Kindle version of this because I was like, I just want to consume as much as I possibly can about this world. It is massive in scope. And I know that might throw some folks off, especially for the first hour. It's just like, I'm going to explain and exposition the hell out of this. And normally that bothers me. It did not in this because it's so beautifully done. I've heard the term slow paced and or boring from some folks, but I think it's deliberately paced, and the pacing did not concern me whatsoever because I was in the entire time. It reminds me of the first season of something like Game of Thrones, where we need to put all these pieces on the board, and then once we go, we have everybody on the board. We're going, and once they go, I just couldn't. This felt epic. You don't get stuff that feels like this. Probably, I haven't felt like this since like the Lord of the Rings in the theater, where it's just like, oh, this is a world. Like you have just created an entire world, and I'm here for it. And so I was in, and sadly, when it was over, when the movie ended, I was like, oh, have they not filmed the second one already? What are they doing?
Yeah, I really wish it turned out that they had just secretly done that and it was ready to go.
Right.
Because, there was so much conversation of, oh, we took this big risk in doing Dune in these two parts. And if it's not good at the box office, we won't get a sequel. And if the HBO Max deal is going to lead people to not go to the box office and we won't finish it. And then Deadline reported an interview with the head of Time Warner and all these bigwigs at the company. And they were like, well, of course, we're going to keep making a Dune. Yeah. Where we've got a show about the witches coming. We've got what are you guys talking about?
We're in this.
Invested deeply into the Dune story. And I was like, oh, great. Why didn't we say this a year ago?
Ages ago. We could have already been off to the races here, guys.
But I also went to the Universal City Walk, which is a proper IMAX. It's in the 1:1.43 by 1 ratio. Most IMAXs are 1.90 to 1, and then you have your regular 2:35 to 1 screen. So you see everything. And watching that screen go from its bar to this wide area, I don't think I've ever in a movie felt like I was walking outside, like that feeling when you see a movie during the day and you walk outside and the sun hits you and you're like, why is the sun out?
I'm disoriented. Yeah.
That is how I felt just by the sheer brightness of the cinematography and how the light pops around rocks and doors and canvases. And there were so many moments where I was like a vampire, just like, oh, I forget. Oh my goodness. I also loved it. It was also I have not read the book. I did purchase a very large hard copy version of it to consume slowly now.
Yeah.
I loved it. I was impressed by all of the actors. It's it's great when you get a like star-studded cast and everybody's performing
Mhm.
at the top of their game. There wasn't one person that wasn't communicating well. I thought they did such a good job of explaining this massive story and lore without overdoing it or overcomplicating it. There was also a lot of show don't tell. We have some imagery with the bull and this history of his uncle and kind of just seeing what the spice does to you. Like there's a lot of exposition, but I felt like nobody stopped the movie to be like, so here's the deal. Just
Right.
kind of a lot of like, if you're paying attention and watching it,
You'll
you
get it.
sort of get what's going on. And they
Mhm.
boil it down then to what isn't necessarily a simple story, but it's a consumable story
Yeah.
in a way that you're like, oh, I get it. Chosen one, prophecy, ABC. We're putting a lot of pieces on the board. There's two warring societies. One of them is under the ground. They want all this spice. We're on this uninhabitable world and we got to go. But my God, the cinematography, not since Blade Runner 2049, no surprise,
Yeah.
had I been so just entrapped in watching like every frame is a painting. It really was just something where I just constantly was like, wow, it's like a museum is all around you. It was just so cool. And the action beats were really well done. The tension was brought up a lot, I think. So small beats when they're in the plane with his wife and he's trying to do the scream and the noise and make it
So
work and they're
well done.
communicating with their hands and then he gets it and
Yeah.
it, incredible. And everything with Oscar Isaac and him getting shot in the back with that poison dart and the cavity in his tooth and it popping out, and the story was so well told
It is.
and it made you want so much more. And I think a lot of people are, if they aren't aware, because I don't think they did a great job unless you're in the know of explaining that this was a part one. I knew a lot of people who were like, oh, I didn't realize till I sat down that I was in for a part one. I thought
Yeah,
we were
like you
getting.
don't get it because none of the advertisement says that. Nothing in their promo runs for anybody has said that. It has been assumed for most that this looks like it's just a one film, and then the movie opens and you get that part one that comes on the screen, and you're like, oh, you just pulled the wool over a lot of people's eyes. Now I was aware of it, but I know a great deal of people were like, wait, what? Huh?
But I guess I also wasn't. I think about the first time I saw Lord of the Rings, and I was 13, and I went with my parents to like a 9:30 movie, and they were both talking about how important this movie was and how incredible this was going to be, and the reverence, and it's Lord of the Rings and these
Right.
stories, and I didn't know anything about it. I was 13, and I walked out of this 3-hour movie as the 13-year-old who until then had basically just watched 90-minute comedies and Spider-Man 2 and was like, one, why was this movie so long? Two, why didn't it have an ending? And I was the whole drive home just like, but it didn't end.
There's no end.
And finally they were like, are you not aware that there's two other books coming? And I think because of that, that's now just out in the ether. Everyone's grown up with Lord of the Rings and seen it. Things like Harry Potter, even the Matrix, Star Wars, even the Marvel movies, nothing really has an ending anymore.
Mhm.
And I sort of felt like, oh yeah, this does sort of wrap up this character arc of Timothy Chalamet trying to almost find purpose. If you look at it through the lens of like
Correct.
character is story, and here's a guy with a lot of different birthrights, and he's ultimately making a decision. And then there's the like quote unquote, it's not after the credits, but what would be like a post credit moment
Right.
that's going to lead us into two. And you're like, okay,
Right.
I feel like this is a complete story.
And it's a good stepping off point. Like we can stop here and we'll come back because his beat is sort of complete as far as what he's about to become
Yeah.
there. Yeah, it's funny because Star Wars falls into that too. Although the very first A New Hope had an ending, and then from that point on, they have never
Unless you
had
think about
one
Darth
since.
Vader flying off into the
That's
sun.
true. That's true.
I can't really think of the last movie that didn't have somebody being like, and then we'll set up
And
another one.
correct.
Like
Like
I just
there's always Lego pieces being put on top of each other. And so I know there are some people who walk out of this and like, oh, this didn't have an ending. And I'm like, it does. if you're paying attention, if you have invested enough into the characters, then you definitely have an ending for what Paul sort of has to go through in this flick.
Now, look, they cut it off at one of the most interesting parts. Like
I
it is
know.
almost designed like a TV show that way, where
It's
it's
like,
Breaking Bad ends, and you're like, "Are we getting season two?
where's the
How could
rest?
you do this?" I mean, like,
Yeah.
but I mean, like, Lord of the Rings was that it was egregious when I was 13 at the end of Fellowship of the Ring. They just sailed off on the boat. No
We're gonna
one's
keep
together. Like,
just gonna keep going. Everybody
what?
separated.
And I'm like, oh man, I'll never forget, just because I love Lord of the Rings so much now, and I'll never forget that just seething car ride home of like, I'm furious.
Do you think that that helps if people know that it's a chapter of a ongoing saga?
Well, of course it does. I think one, it kind of gives you an idea of what to expect. I think there is a catharsis in an ending that is more traditional that you don't get. There is kind of the revelation of theme and the closure of all these concluding
Right.
storylines, and the, you know, people want to walk out with like evil is defeated. We don't really want to walk out when it hasn't been. I think, you know, Infinity War, we all knew what was coming. Lord of the Rings, except for me,
Mhm.
knew what was coming. Empire Strikes Back, we knew we were getting another
Yeah.
one.
It
If you weren't very clear on it, I could see where you would be like, but you guys kind of just, you had 3 hours to tell me a story,
and you
and you
chose to
told me
still not end
half a
it.
story.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you
I
still
could see
didn't
where
end it.
people would be upset.
Yeah. That's a good point. I feel like I don't know. I'm a moviegoer that I prefer, even though like you said with Infinity War, I knew what was going to happen, but I like not ending on a happy note or a high note. I might be bizarre, but I sort of like, hey, there's more to come. We'll be
I think
back.
it's almost less of a happy or sad note and more of like, what is this story ultimately about? And the ending, usually happy ending or
Has
sad ending, gives you that like,
and this
hey, if we
one,
were talking about environmentalism, here's what we were saying about
right?
environmentalism. And this one is like, we'll tell you later.
We'll get to that in a
This
bit.
movie basically has a secret, and your friend's telling you he's going to tell you at lunch. And then at lunch, whoever the secret's about sits down and he's like, I'll tell you at the end of the day. And you're
Yeah.
like, you son of a bitch. I know you
Hmm.
have a secret.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of knew. I mean, I think some people with the press, if they were actually paying attention, the director has gone out to say that if you're coming to see this film for Zendaya, sorry, like she's not really in it. Yeah, she's in all the promos, she's doing all the tours. She's going to be a bigger character in the second one, and that sort of should lead people to sort of know what they're kind of getting into because she is probably on the pecking order right now. She would be the number two person that they've sort of put out there, but she's
Oh yeah,
barely
I
in
mean
this.
those trailers, and we know, I think they've said the next one is her character's point of view.
Right.
So I see what we're doing, but it is a little like, oh, okay, y'all showed me that dream sequence a lot. We could
Yes.
have, I'm not saying we needed to save time because I loved this movie, but if we were gonna
About
save some time,
about 5-10 minutes of that, you could start shaving
now look,
some
am I
off of that.
saying that you can have enough dreams about Zendaya? Of course
Of course not.
not. But if we're gonna save time, I
Yeah.
know where we can do it. But that being said, this movie is obviously so far being called a success. It's on its way to make a lot of money despite its HBO Max setup, which we'll talk about later. But
Yeah.
we have tried to make Dune really not once, but twice, once in a TV show setting, which also didn't work.
Mm-mm.
You attempted to watch
I
this
did.
movie.
I did.
Are you aware of what David Lynch almost made had he not made Dune?
No.
He would have made Return of the Jedi.
Wow. Okay. Well, I'm glad that he did not get that because that would have been a completely different fucking. I don't know what that movie would have been. Yeah, no, I had not seen. I was aware that David Lynch had done this, and I was aware that there seems to be two factions. There's a faction who are Dune fans that are like he completely butchered and did God knows what to it, and there's some David Lynch fans who are like David Lynch is a weird man, and I kind of dig this. But there's those two groups don't intersect. They never ever merge. And so I watched this. I was like, all right, for this show, I was like, well, we usually talk about the previous and whatever sort of come before this. So let me like put an eye on this. So I cracked on HBO Max. That's where they have it there. And I was like, all right, let's see what's going on. I made it 45 minutes into that movie. And I was like, I can't do this anymore. I don't know what this is. It's weird now thinking about it, some of it, watching this one and going and kind of thinking of it as, oh, I can see what he was attempting to kind of pull from pieces of the book, but he just does a very different, a whole bizarre one of it. I think this movie does, the current one, Denis version, does a much better in just the first 10 minutes of giving us exposition. That movie chooses to give us exposition by just having a floating head at the opening scene. It's like, I'm going to talk you to death for 5 minutes straight about what you should know there. I'm like, well, that's a bizarre way to introduce a world. Okay. And has this weird thing of having folks do their inner monologue so that the audience can hear it instead of just kind of like being an actor and doing it and thinking it. Like, I'm going to have the inner monologue be said out loud, and I can't quite tell who's saying the inner monologue with three people on the scene at the same time. Why is this a choice? All of this movie was just, I don't know what's happening. And it's a weird thing because I think this movie is very dense. I mean, this book clearly is very dense, and I haven't read
there's
it,
a
but I'll get to
Bible
that
in the back of it.
Right. But it's clear that David Lynch is like, cool. I like a couple of those concepts. I'll pull that. I'm going to do my own thing. And I think that's why a lot of people were kind of torn on where they stand with this. He makes a lot of swings that I don't think hit in a lot of cases.
No, I don't think Dune was the let's take a big risk property. I mean, could you imagine if somebody had done that with like the first Harry Potter movie and we're like, well, we're just going to there's magic and a boy. That's all we're doing.
One of the craziest things to me that I'm sitting here, especially now after seeing it, because Timothée Chalamet looks like a teenager, like he looks like a child. He's supposed to be young. Kyle in the David Lynch one looks like he's a 25-year-old, 30-year-old, and that makes a huge difference as to what I'm making my quest to grow up and figure out my purpose. But in this film, I'm like, well, he should know his purpose. He's a grown ass man by now.
Well, Terrence, a lot of dwindling 25-year-olds are coming up and now realizing
still figuring
it
out.
They all thought they were going to have it at 25. It's a fallacy.
Yeah.
Things are going to happen. You have no idea. The spice is so important. No, I agree. That first movie, it's very experimental. It deters a lot. There's a lot of style, but there was also a ton of studio interference in it. We kind of get this weird muddled half his movie, half their movie. It isn't quite Dune, and it was truncated to fit the book. I think now we live in a time where studios almost want you to go, well, can we make 9 movies in an HBO show?
Yeah.
Where, in the 80s, it was like The Empire Strikes Back, I believe, grossed less than A New Hope. We were still seeing diminishing returns on sequels. So I'm sure that they weren't like the Dune universe.
You're right. And sci-fi was that
Dune.
genre. Yeah. Sci-fi was that genre. They were like, we don't really care. We're not throwing that much money. We don't care about this because the returns weren't there.
So it's a shame. It really is a weird thing to be like, man, he was going to do this bonkers movie to end Star Wars, and instead just crapped out this adaptation.
David doesn't put his name on it. Like, he doesn't claim it. Like, he's like, yeah, that's I don't really, because I guess they took it away from him. Like, an hour of the film is cut. It's just a lot that went around this property. And it's a studded cast. Like, Patrick Stewart's in it and Brad Dourif. And you're like, wow, this is
it really
talent.
Probably was the Justice League of that time. I'm sure if Twitter existed in 1984, there would have been a release the Lynch cut.
Correct.
It sounds like there's this massive director's cut.
Correct.
That we'll never get to see, that now we can bully studios for better or worse, and they'll eventually make
and they'll cave.
Got to get those streaming service numbers.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. And it's funny then that we kind of went back to this well, because then we tried to make this TV show that also just didn't work, even though that seems like a much more appropriate medium for this.
As dense it is, that makes more sense.
But it just didn't ever quite catch, which is weird because like in the 80s, sci-fi was starting to get there. We were getting a lot of Star Trek. Star Wars was getting big. Battlestar, was a lot happening in that space. So it's odd that the sci-fi novel couldn't quite find its footing until now. And I wonder how much of that is just like money. But I also wonder, we get into the like, well, why are we doing this? And I feel like something I hear people say a lot when they're like, oh, they remake everything. They should remake bad movies and make them good. And every now and then I'm like, you're missing the point that 9 times out of 10 they want money. They're
Yeah,
not
like
gonna.
you're not gonna. I'm gonna pick the thing that no one actually knows, and I'm gonna remake
Also,
that.
like, what an insult to those filmmakers to be like, hey, we're gonna take this terrible thing you made,
Yeah.
we're going to give it 3 times the budget, and we're going to give it to this person, and maybe they can fix your horrible mistake. So I don't know. I mean, I'm with it. I would love it to see, but like, I wouldn't get excited. I can't think of a horrible movie that exists that I'm like, but if only.
Right.
I don't know what an example of that is. If you have it, tell me, because I hear this argument all the time. And whenever I'm like what?
Why don't you
People are
take
never
bad
like,
movies that no one knows and read them? Like, or do you have one? Do you have like 3 of them that you can
what are
name
you
off
saying?
really
We got to make
quickly?
an A24 Troll 2 movie? Is that the pitch? Because yes,
Yeah.
now that I say it out loud, let's do it. But so
Yeah.
like the first reason that I feel like we're doing this again is just that we've now made things like Lord of the Rings. We've created things like the MCU, the Matrix, these giant, enormous universes that have shows and sequels and
Mhm.
everything under the sun. And we can finally give this story the budget and scope and talent that it deserves. And you even hear these things of him. Like, I don't know how true this is, but somebody told me that uh, Dennis did Blade Runner 49 as practice for sci-fi for Dune. I was like, you
This is
can't take
this is my
that's like
this is my previs. Like this
what is that, like training against the 96 Bulls
the
to
two
have your own
this
championship?
2 hour masterpiece that I've made is my practice run.
Oh, okay. I
Sure.
guess if we're just gonna take
If that's the level, the cheat
giant,
code we're doing, massive.
influential,
Yeah.
amazing pieces of art and be like, this is basically T-ball for
I
me.
don't. I'm just throwing this. This is just
I'm
here.
just getting my stance right. Sure,
What?
why not?
Okay.
So we're doing it again. He's not doing that, but it really, I think you get to see that. You see a modern direction, a like really filled out world, and then there is always the like introduction to a new audience. And with this movie and this book, I'm like, this is a great example, because I feel like, the popular joke on Twitter I always see is like, oh, guy who sees one movie is like, man, this new movie is really giving me Iron Man vibes. And it's like, yes, but like there was an order.
There's
Things
an.
happened
Oh,
before you were
yeah, and
born.
I've heard so many people doing and be like, "Oh, this reminds me of like Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings." So the guys, can you look at the timestamp of when that first book came out? I think you might have your order incorrect. People are like, "Oh, Halloween, so many things are stolen from that. Like this movie is stealing from that." I'm like, guys, Halloween's the originator of all of these things. You might want to just do some homework.
Right. It's not even hard homework, just like a quick Wikipedia search. I'm not even saying you need to watch the whole franchise.
No.
Just like, it's like, well, yeah, like they did it. But so Dune, this book is written in the 60s. I believe it really started being written in like 1959 before it was published. The age of Aquarius is where is
Yes.
where we are in the world. And it's pretty crazy because we talk about unsuccessful adaptations about Dune, but in so many ways, Star Wars was a successful adaptation of Dune.
Correct.
You get the Empire to the Baron. We start on Tatooine instead of Akaris. We're dealing with kind of these like big political ideas, this notion of a prophecy and a chosen one, but Luke has multiple birthrights. It's to the Jedi, it's to his father, it's to Obi-Wan, to the rebellion. We're seeing that same internal struggle and pull. And that's not because George Lucas is as smart of a writer as Hubbard was.
We can see how that turns out as it goes along. Yes.
I'm not saying George Lucas isn't a smart writer. He's
He
obviously, he created
is.
Star Wars. He's a brilliant man, but
Yeah.
like, we're not artists, we're thieves. And a great art, like that's where we are. And it's crazy because then I feel like you even get into things like the Matrix, these ideas of altering your state of consciousness and your reality, and stories about what is that reality and how do we monetize that and keep some people subdued and keep some people awake and really use that, becomes such a big part of the Matrix. and so
Right.
many other, and again, like this prophecy, the idea of the chosen one also wasn't created by Hubbard. That goes back even further. Even his own book was influenced by people that came before him. But we're now getting to this place where the books were always granted that longevity and time to gestate. And we kind of needed Dune to exist to get a lot of the sci-fi we have now. And it really wasn't until Lord of the Rings, I feel like, that we had a movie and an adaptation that matched the scope of the book.
Yeah.
And it was that kind of success and that kind of cliffhanger that left me complaining on a car ride home after I watched one of the single greatest films of all time, to then make studios, ironically, the same studio go, oh, well, we can leave them hanging as long as the quality keeps
As
up.
long as everything before it comes is right, is as a top quality.
And I mean, they're still making Dune books, but we now do live in a world where we go, well, we're going to tell you this story in the movie, and we're going to tell you this one on our streaming service. This one's going to be an Audible podcast, whatever. And I feel like all of that, the technology, the way the studios operate, the mentality is what is allowing Dune to be a successful adaptation now. We're not truncating the work. So ironically, all of the things that Dune influenced sort of are now influencing Dune.
Right.
And I think this is one of the first times on the podcast that we've really come around full circle to be like, well, why are we doing this? We did it before, and it did all of these wonderful things for the industry. And because of that, we're now able to do it right.
Yeah.
It's interesting that those are the kind of ways that we now do it. We just didn't make movies that way.
Yeah. I we've gotten into this world, this time now where when you get one property, if you're good or if you have a following, you end up getting like several things happening at once. Star Wars sort of kind of created that, but Harry Potter has bled on to become these Fantastic Beasts. Quality aside, because I don't know if I really want those, but it's become something else, and then we're going to get something else. Lord of the Rings has now become a television series. Game of Thrones has had like failed pilots that we haven't even seen yet, and also other spinoffs. I think we're in this world now where if something hits, you're going to get as much as you possibly can of that mind to you. And it's a wild time to be around, because I don't know if obviously these original creators didn't always intend for their stuff to get just mass produced and flipped over time and time again. But if it's done well and the audience wants it, it does satiate a quest for, because all of these worlds that these people have created, the Lord of the Rings world, the Matrix world, this world, are massive. And so there's so many pockets of stories that, yeah, the grand story, we say this with Star Wars all the time, like, why do we keep getting the Skywalker stories? These worlds are so massive that, yes, the movies can tell this grand story about Paul and his stuff, but we can go off world and tell about all the stuff that's, yes, we know the Spice Planet is the planet that everything sort of revolves around, but there's so much other shit happening in this world. Just like you said with the Witches spinoff the prequel that we're going to get, like, yeah, they're a small piece of this world. Those witches are not as grand, but they're so powerful and so interesting that I'm like, yeah, I would like to know way more about them. Sure.
Well, it's all these things that pique your curiosity in the movie, and that's something that they do very well. We see him enter this weird room. It's the only time his mom is afraid and like in pain, physical pain.
Yeah.
And he's presented with this box and then a knife to his throat. And it's that simple thing. You're going to go through a lot of pain. And if you resist the pain, I'm going to kill you.
I'm going to kill you. Yeah.
An animal will cut off its own limb to survive. What are you going to do? And this one simple scene that tells us a lot about just Timothy Chalamet's character and just his mom's character.
And his mom, yeah. And this world where she was put off to have an heir, but they were only wanting daughters. Like, oh, wow, you just giving me so much information in literally like 15 minutes.
In seconds. And we don't need Zordon to stare at us and tell us it. We kind of understand a lot of like, she doesn't really want to do this. He almost seems apathetic in that moment because he is being pulled at, like, everywhere he goes for the first half of this movie. He almost has this like zoned out teenager expression of just like, yeah, I know we're going to do the armory, and I
I
know
gotta
you're going to show
train.
me all this, and
Yeah.
now mom's going to do her thing, and I get it. I'm going to be this great leader. It's like, it isn't really until he finds his own purpose. Like, there's that line that Oscar Isaac has of like, the great leaders they don't want to do it. They're called into it.
Yeah.
And we see all of these callings that aren't connecting to him. But in that witch's scene, we do specifically get so much of their small world that you are like, I want to know everything about this.
Yeah.
And he directs it in such a clear way of why this world affects the main character we're following, and yet piques our curiosity. But he doesn't do it in a muddled way where it stops the pacing or it makes me confused. We could go the rest of this movie without really seeing
Yeah.
them. It
Like I
almost,
don't need it to tell the story that you're telling me in front of me, but my interest is piqued.
the closest thing I can think of to it is in A New Hope, when Obi-Wan gives him the lightsaber and is like, your dad did some stuff in the Clone Wars. We're done with the Clone Wars.
Yeah.
But like, everybody sat there in that theater being like, the Clone War. Well, that
What is
sounds,
this you speak of?
there hasn't been a single clone in this film. And it's kind of that same, like, that lure that pulls you in, and that keeps happening. Like Josh Brolin's character, the way they show the shields, even, I was like, ooh,
Yeah.
I would just want
Yeah.
to, I want like a Q scene where you're just telling me how this tech works. But
Correct.
again, I understand it from the simple of like, well, it's blue and it's not that bad, and then it
Yeah.
gets red and it's bad,
It's some
and
terrible
it's
things.
really
Yeah.
bad. Like, okay, got it. Like, so many visual cues to pick up on, and just such great imagery. The Baron lifting himself up because he can't move when he's in
Yeah.
that sludge talking to Dave Bautista. You get all the notions of how this world works and why the spice is important. But I don't think they ever sat down and were like, here's why it's important.
Yeah.
But you get the sense of like, well, everyone's after this.
Right.
There's
It
obviously something big. It's working like a drug, but they want it to be monetized. And the people on the planet are like, get in and get out.
right. And there's an emperor sort of pulling the strings to everybody, kind of like playing puppetry. It's a weird thing. The way that I filtered it for my brain to sort of accept everything. It's like, oh, this is like a wild game of capture the flag, and everybody needs to capture the planet. This spice planet is their flag, and whoever has it is the one where everybody else starts coming after them. I was like, that's easy. Cool, got it. Thanks.
Well, it's what I think a good director does, is they can take a story that we've seen a lot, that is very like, he's been prophesized to do something, there's currency on this planet, and there are people fighting over it, and these are themes and ideas that resonate forever, and we'll get
Right.
into that in a moment. But then you paint it with all the pieces of filmmaking to showcase it in a way that we've never really seen it before. And I think it's even why when the first Matrix came out, we were really blown away. And I love the first Matrix. 45 minutes of that film is exposition.
Yes.
It's a lot of just like world, 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 world.
Correct.
And it is that weird thing of like, but it's done in such a compelling way that I don't mind.
Right.
This is almost a like deeper version of that, where I'm like, you're almost telling me so little information, yet I'm understanding it and I don't mind.
Yeah.
And I really I want Dune to be like a Toys R Us in the 90s, where I can just run through every aisle and read the back
Give
of
me that
every
info.
card
Yeah.
box,
Yes. Yes.
and just be like, oh my God. Like, it's such a, they do it in such a great way. But you come back to these big themes when we talk about like, well, why today? Why 2021? Outside of all of the tech and the reasons we talked about. And I think the best part about any sci-fi are these themes that we keep looking at through different lenses. And obviously the first lens we looked at was in the 1960s, was during the age of Aquarius, which I keep saying for two specific reasons. One, it's what the 60s was sort of called. But two, we called it that because of the astrological alignment of the planets at the time, that they thought was when humanity would take control of the earth and own its destiny as a rightful heritage, which is very much what Dune is about.
Right.
And what the 60s sort of became about in a weird way, of everybody going through these experimental phases and trying to figure out who they are and what they want and their place.
Yeah, very much.
In the
If
world.
anyone hasn't watched or heard of Hair, you should, because that's basically what that entire play is, like figuring out your purpose in life. Yeah.
And it's funny because then you look at that, through everything else going on, we're dealing with environmental stress. The 60s had that. We're dealing with altered states of consciousness. We're dealing with
Yeah,
the idea of human potential, a revolution against imperialism and against this higher government. And you come back to it now in 2021 and you sort of go, oh, well, not too much has changed. There's always going to be relevance in a theme of who you are and where your heritage is pulling you and what you're going to become and all of that. But we're still fighting against some bad forms of whatever you want to call it, imperialism, tyranny, fascism, whatever item it is. There's always this
it's
kind of like
there.
rebellious urge against it. We're back in new altered states of consciousness. You could make the argument that we're doing that with social media, with new drugs and
Right.
legalized drugs, and we're still playing with what that means. And now we have legalized marijuana, and we're taxing it, and who has it, and what's doing what with
And
it, and
who's responsible for it, who's bringing it in, who's doing, yeah, it's all there.
it's pretty interesting that it's almost timeless in that way. I think it even becomes like, I mean, it's so on the nose, but if you're like, well, spice is like oil, and we're always kind of doing this, and
There's always going
there's
to be
all
some product that exists. Like there's a lot of, like, you're going to have parallelisms, and that's what good sci-fi always sort of does. It's going to be parallels to the things that are happening in your real life. But yeah, you're going to always have something that everybody wants, and then the world is sort of circling around that. Oil being part of one of those. For a while there, alcohol was that drug, like people bootlegging and all that stuff. It cycles something. It always moves to the next thing, but it's going to always be there. And you have social classes. You have people. The witches are told, like, you're only supposed to have women, or you're only supposed to date within your quote unquote your own race, your own kind. That's always going to be a part. Like all of these type of things are always a part of this, and that's sort of why good sci-fi, like really well done sci-fi, always sort of keeps. If you peel back the layers of all the tech and all the effects and whatever, however it's shot, sci-fi at the core is still very much about humanity and whatever it is that we are actually going through currently.
exactly. It's a very interesting beat of like, well, it's always, I feel like you always see somebody who's like, well, we don't need our politics here, and it's like, well, sci-fi, even like sci-fi adventure, sci-fi fantasy, whatever they call the Star Wars subgenre,
Right.
even that has these themes in it, but that is so much more about the individual and the quest and all of these things, where things like Dune are much more about the world. And
Yeah. You
it's
get like
more
the Gattacas of the world are much more like, all right, let's talk about the work, like let's talk about the thesis of life
right
with the backdrop of sci-fi having being there.
with
Yeah.
some really cool shit in it.
Right.
And I like, we touched on it a little bit before, but the last thing I talk about, because we don't have box office numbers, but I believe that this is currently on its way to do incredibly well.
Yeah, it's killing it. They're saying they're killing around 53, 55 opening weekend with, and it's already around the 200. It's going to cross 200 worldwide, which is it's insane, because I don't think, look, I think people have already been looking like, all right, this movie's going to do well, but they didn't know, because sci-fi, it's a dense film, it's such a slow moving and it's a long pace. They didn't expect it to make or go anywhere what it's doing. My theater was packed. I believe yours was too.
Oh yeah, yeah.
There's an audience for this bigger than I think that they were anticipating, and I think Denis is sort of building an audience as he goes along. He's capturing he's capturing audiences as he goes along. Like, yo, if he's putting out a movie, I should be there. And
Well,
it's
and
becoming these experiences now.
this is a cross-generational audience. My
Correct.
dad's excited, I'm excited, people younger than me are excited, and it really kind of proves a lot of those weird, like, well, is HBO Max gonna this decision? It's like, well, clearly people are deciding what to go see.
They're choosing.
Clearly
Choosing.
your
Yeah.
family movies, your Space Jams are not doing well because people want to take their unvaccinated kids to the theater. This makes sense to me. The Suicide Squad actually did fine, I think.
Yeah, it
People
did. And they were in
that.
comparison it to other superhero films, and that's sort of where
Well,
that
that's
was their
dumb because one
downfall.
superhero film is the highest grossing film of
Yeah.
all time. So we don't need to do that.
Right.
Other R-rated superhero movies,
Right.
that's where you should be putting that.
Correct.
Does fine.
Yeah.
I hope this bodes well for The Matrix, but clearly this, I think, just speaks to the IMAX, the experience, the sound, the smashing waves, the design, the score, even.
This was the first time that I heard so many people like, yeah, I know it's coming out on HBO Max, and I probably will watch it there, but I need to first see it at a theater. And I'm like, oh, so there are still films that people actually like, that's a theatrical experience. I probably should watch that there first.
Oh, yeah, I think that's always going to be the case. I think as we get more and more options, people are going to start kind of weeding out what is and isn't worth going to the theater to see. And I think Dune, just the look of it is like, I'm usually not a big, like, we got to go to the IMAX, but I sat there and was like, I'm so glad we did this.
Glad I made this
I
choice.
almost needed sunglasses on, but my God.
You know what's funny? It's something that they don't track that I wish, it's weird because the world is changing. They don't do this, but I wish there was a way to track people who saw it, because I'm one of them who saw it in the theater like the first couple of days and then went back to HBO Max and rewatched and watched it again.
Terrence, you're asking your iPhone to do a lot more tracking than it's already doing and what most people are comfortable with. I don't need my AMC app tethered to my HBO Max account.
Like, and then Terrence went and watched this.
Consumer data.
Yeah. And then Terrence went and watched this immediately afterwards. Would you like to know what he did? What he ate?
They're way bolder than me. I had a friend who left the theater and he was like, I'm putting it on right when I get home. And I was like, man, this was like a fettuccine Alfredo meal. I gotta walk heavy. This one off.
Yeah. I do plan to watch it again relatively soon. But I might chop it down. I may not watch all 3 hours back, like all of it together, but it is something that I definitely want to sit back through, because again, I know a lot of people, that first hour is very dense and they're explaining a lot. And I think if I go back to rewatch it now that I've seen what happens in the back half, I will appreciate even more, because it didn't bother me, but I think I would appreciate even more the first half of this flick and the explanation of all factions and worlds and what we get. But I'm just curious to kind of see how many people went, because I've heard that a lot. People be like, yeah, no, I watched it in theater and I'm gonna go right back and watch it again. I'm like, well,
older than me. It's a long time.
Yeah.
A good time, but a long time. It's like we saw that at 6:30. It was like 10. What am I, 19? I'm gonna watch a 3-hour movie at 10 o'clock.
And then come back. Yeah.
Man.
I know they're going to do it, and Warner Brothers is all but said like it's happening. What's the spacing of time? Are like they're going to just be like, yo, go film this now? Like, you got to get all these actors back. Like, by the time they get this in front of the audience, I mean the cast back, they're probably not going to start shooting this till like late 2022. So we won't get this to 2024. I'm thinking.
Oh, that can't be correct.
Which is just insane.
That can't be right. They have to have a better plan than that.
I would feel like as well as it's being received, that this should be a little further along than the typical, all right, we're going to start filming now, we stop filming, and then it's going to take a year and a half before we actually put this out. I
mean, I'll accept 2023. 2024, I'm like, I don't know, guys.
Yeah.
That's an undertaking.
It is.
I want to see those sandworms again because they were great.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole thing was great. I really hope that we can get it sooner than that, because
I do too.
On the plus side, I might finish the book before then, which would be nice to do.
It's true.
Well, that's our show, guys. That's it. That's Dune, an awesome movie. If you feel safe enough to go to the IMAX theater, I highly recommend it. Otherwise, enjoy it at HBO Max. I'm not here to judge. See the movie, consume the art, do it.
Yes.
You can, of course, follow the show at Hollywood ADI on Twitter and Instagram. I'm at, as always, Blake. Terrence is at Terrence Tatum. And don't forget to leave us a review on the podcast app or a comment on the YouTube channel. And we will see you guys next 2 weeks, because next week is Last Night in Soho, which we're not doing. And then we're back for Eternals.
Yes.
Great. There we go. Pulled that one out of my hat. Great. We will see you guys in 2 weeks.
Later.